No one in the Carter mansion had ever heard Noah speak a single word. Until that day, when his tiny voice shattered 4 years of silence and called out a name no one expected. And it wasn't Dad, it was Amara. The room froze. James Carter, a man who could negotiate million-dollar deals without blinking, felt his knees weaken at the sound. His 4-year-old son, mute since birth, had chosen to speak for the first time, not to him, not to a doctor, but to the new black maid he barely knew. It was a moment that would change everything in this house. Before we dive into what happened and why this one word would shake the walls of a millionaire's home, where are you watching from right now? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring you more powerful, true-to-life stories that touch the heart. Under the crimson glow of an October sunset, the Carter Mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, stood like a polished fortress, glass walls, gleaming walnut floors, and art worth more than most people's homes. But behind the opulence lay a silence so heavy it seemed to press on every surface. Noah Carter, with his wide hazel eyes and messy brown curls, sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, tapping his small fingers on the glass in an odd rhythm, as if he was speaking to a world only he understood. He had never spoken, not one word in 4 years, and his father, James Carter, had stopped expecting him to. James was a man built on ambition and loss. At 42, he was a real estate mogul with a billion-dollar portfolio, a name known in every luxury market in the South. But at home, in the quiet shadow of his wife Clara's death during childbirth, he was powerless. The grief he never learned to face drove him into his work, leaving Noah in the hands of nannies who rotated through the mansion like guests in a hotel. Over a dozen had tried, none stayed. Noah's silence, sometimes broken by sudden bursts of frustration, sent them all packing. Specialists from Atlanta, New York, Boston, every one of them had examined Noah. No hearing loss, no cognitive delays. Some whispered about autism, others about selective mutism. But no one could give James the clear solution he demanded. In private, he wrestled with guilt he could neither name nor bury deep enough, hiding behind boardroom victories while failing in the one role he couldn't delegate, being a father. That October morning, Eleanor Price, the housekeeper, announced the arrival of the new maid. Eleanor had run this mansion for 20 years with a silver bun pulled tight and an even tighter sense of control. She didn't like change, and she especially didn't like strangers she hadn't approved herself. When Amara Johnson stepped into the grand foyer, carrying a plain cloth bag and wearing a worn shirt, Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Amara was 34, with a quiet strength in the way she stood and a calm warmth in her voice when she greeted James. She came from Southwest Atlanta's poorest streets, where survival meant raising her 3 younger siblings after her mother's death. James glanced at her over the top of his laptop. "Have you worked with kids?" he asked. His tone clipped, as if already half decided she wouldn't last a week. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice low but sure. "I know how to listen to them." It wasn't the resume he wanted. It wasn't the polished pedigree Eleanor believed the household deserved. But James, buried in financial reports for a midtown skyscraper deal, simply waved her toward Eleanor and returned to his work. He expected nothing to change. No one told Amara about Noah's silence. She discovered it herself within the first hour. She found him in the living room, not meeting her eyes, his fingers tapping the armrest like a soft drum beat. She didn't fill the air with forced questions. She didn't move too quickly. Instead, she sat nearby, folding laundry, humming an old folk song her mother used to sing, one of those melodies that felt like warm sunlight through thin curtains. Noah didn't look up, but he didn't leave either. He kept listening. By the second day, She noticed how he stiffened at sudden noises but leaned forward when light filtered through the tall windows. On the third, she brought paper and crayons, drawing slow, round circles until Noah's tiny hand began copying hers. On the fifth, she folded a paper airplane and let it glide across the room. For the first time, he smiled. Just a flicker, but enough to make her heart catch. Eleanor, watching from the hallway, saw danger in that smile. For years, she'd been the one in charge when James wasn't home. This new maid, with no degree, no proper background, had crossed an invisible line. Thomas Reed, James's 35-year-old personal assistant, saw it too, ambitious and eager to keep his influence over James intact. He joined Eleanor in whispered conversations. "She has no credentials," Eleanor murmured. "She's from the slums," Thomas replied, his tone dripping with contempt. But Amara didn't waste energy on their whispers. Every evening she wrote in a small journal, notes about Noah's moods, what made him tap faster, what slowed him down, the way his eyes followed her when she sang. She knew she wasn't there to fix him. She was there to make him feel seen. And slowly, though James barely noticed, something in the mansion began to shift. By the end of the first week, Noah no longer left the room when Amara entered. By the end of the second, he would let her guide his hand when drawing. Eleanor and Thomas saw it as a threat. Amara saw it as trust. Trust she would protect at any cost. She didn't know the storm they were preparing to unleash on her. From the moment Amara began to find small ways into Noah's quiet world, Eleanor Price and Thomas Reed decided she didn't belong in their eyes. The Carter mansion was a hierarchy, and Amara had skipped the long climb to the top by winning Noah's attention too quickly. Eleanor's resentment grew each time she walked past the living room and saw the boy sitting closer to Amara than he ever had to anyone else. Thomas, who prided himself on being James Carter's right hand, feared that if Amara earned James's trust through Noah, she could shift the balance in the house, and that was something he couldn't allow. Their alliance formed over whispered criticisms in the pantry and knowing glances in the hallway. "She's only here a week and already acting like she's in charge," Eleanor hissed one evening, drying a wine glass with unnecessary force. "James is too distracted to see it," Thomas replied. "But I'm not. She's playing the long game." Amara didn't rise to their bait. She knew the hostility was there. Eleanor's cool glances, Thomas's clipped greetings, but she had been through worse. Growing up, she'd faced people who judged her by her address, her skin, her lack of a polished resume. She'd learned long ago that the best way to answer suspicion was with quiet consistency. So she focused on Noah every morning. She greeted him the same way, a gentle, "Good morning, Noah," followed by the soft hum of the folk songs she'd been singing since day one. She gave him choices, blue crayon or green, apple slices or banana, and when he didn't answer, she waited. Sometimes he pointed, sometimes he stared, and she'd make the choice for him, narrating it out loud. She didn't push for words. She built patterns, safety, familiarity. But Eleanor and Thomas didn't stop at passive disapproval. They began planting seeds in James's mind. One morning, Eleanor accidentally spilled hot coffee on Amara's shirt in front of James. "Oh my, I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "But really, she's so clumsy. I worry about her around the boy." James barely looked up from his laptop, muttering something about being careful, but the comment stuck in the back of his mind. Later that week, Thomas leaned casually against the doorway to James's home office. "Hey, boss, just a heads up," he began, in the tone of someone sharing a favor. "I noticed my watch went missing from the living room. I'm sure it'll turn up, but, you know, maybe keep an eye out." He didn't accuse Amara outright, but the implication was clear. James, knee-deep in negotiations for a $500 million commercial deal, nodded distractedly, not realizing how the suggestion was meant to fester, in the kitchen. Amara found her ally in Sophie Miller, the young chef whose warmth was as constant as the smell of fresh bread that filled the room every morning. Sophie had been at the mansion for 3 years and had her own quiet run-ins with Eleanor's controlling ways. "Don't let her get to you," Sophie told Amara over a pot of simmering soup. "Eleanor hates anyone who doesn't treat her like royalty, and Thomas, well, he's only loyal to himself." Amara appreciated Sophie's honesty, but she didn't want to turn the house into sides. She simply said, "Noah's my focus. The rest is noise." Dr. Samuel Brooks noticed the changes, too. He had been working with Noah on and off for a year, without much progress. When he stopped by for a scheduled session, he was surprised to find Noah seated calmly beside Amara, holding a crayon and following her slow, deliberate movements across the page. "He's watching you," Samuel observed. "He doesn't do that with me." Amara shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I think he just knows I'm not going anywhere." Samuel smiled knowingly. "That's bigger than you think." But to Eleanor and Thomas, Noah's progress was exactly why Amara needed to go. Their small jabs turned into outright sabotage. Eleanor began forgetting to tell Amara about schedule changes, setting her up to appear unprepared. Thomas spread whispers to the security staff that Amara was working an angle, suggesting she might try to get James to rewrite his will. Then came the most damaging move of all, a fabricated audio recording. Eleanor recorded her own voice, sharp and scolding, then edited it to sound as though Amara were yelling at Noah, with Thomas's help. They played the clip for James, framing it as evidence that Amara's kindness was an act to manipulate Noah for job security. James listened, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't sound like her," he said slowly. But doubt had already crept in. His life had taught him to be suspicious, to protect his son from any potential harm. "We just think you should know," Thomas said. Feigning concern, Eleanor nodded solemnly, as if burdened by the duty of telling the truth. That evening, James walked into the living room and found Amara sitting on the rug, Noah beside her, carefully stacking wooden blocks. "Amara," James began, his voice firm, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, sensing the tension. "What is it? Have you been harsh with Noah?" His words were cautious, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Amara's chest tightened. "No, sir," she said evenly. "Never." James studied her face, searching for cracks, but found none. Still. The recording's echo lingered in his mind. He left the room without another word, his doubt now a shadow between them. In the days that followed, Amara felt the shift. James's greetings grew shorter. Eleanor's smirk widened. Thomas avoided her entirely, as if the trap were already set. But she kept her focus on Noah. If anything, the tension only made her more determined. She noticed he was tapping less, making longer eye contact, even handing her toys without being asked. She began to believe they were on the edge of something remarkable, something worth protecting at any cost. And then, on a rainy afternoon not long after, that breakthrough came. A single word from Noah's lips that would unravel every lie Eleanor and Thomas had spun. But Amara didn't know it yet. All she knew was that in this house of glass and whispers, the quiet moments she shared with Noah were the most unbreakable thing she had. Rain streaked down the Carter mansion's glass walls, the steady drumming on the roof making the grand rooms feel smaller, more enclosed. Amara sat cross-legged on the rug in the grand foyer, a blanket spread out beneath her and a small fleet of toy spaceships scattered between her and Noah. She'd noticed early on that Noah loved the idea of flying things, paper airplanes, bubbles, anything that moved through the air, and today she'd decided to turn it into a game. She lay back, lifting him gently into the air with her legs, pretending he was a ship launching into space. His mouth curved into a silent laugh, his eyes alive in a way James had never seen. That was exactly when James walked in. He'd returned early from a meeting in New York, suitcase in hand, expecting to find the house as it always was, quiet, controlled, and a little cold. Instead, he saw his son aloft in Amara's arms, radiant and laughing without a sound. "What's going on here?" James's voice cut through the room, sharper than the rain outside. The joy in Noah's face faltered. Amara slowly set him down, her movements calm and deliberate, though her heart had begun to race. She'd felt the strain in James's words all week, the residue of Eleanor and Thomas's lies. Noah clung to her hand, his small fingers wrapping tight, his body leaning toward her instead of away. James took a step closer, his eyes narrowed. "I asked you a question," he said, his tone more accusatory than curious. And then it happened. Noah tilted his head up toward James, then back to Amara. His lips parted. The sound was small at first, almost like a breath, but it was a word. "Amara." The syllables floated into the room like a spark catching dry wood. James froze. His briefcase slid from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. "What did he just say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Noah's gaze held steady as he repeated it, louder this time. "Amara!" The name rang through the foyer, ricocheting off the marble and glass. For 4 years, James had begged, bargained, and paid experts for a moment like this, and it had never come. Now, his son had broken his silence not for him, not for any doctor, but for the woman he'd doubted since the day she walked in the door. Amara's eyes filled, though she didn't move to claim the victory. She just smiled softly, letting Noah's hand rest against hers. James's knees bent, and he crouched down to his son's level. "Noah, you spoke," he murmured, as if saying it out loud might make it vanish. His eyes flicked to Amara, searching her face for answers, but before he could ask, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, Thomas just behind her, both feigning surprise at the scene. "Well, isn't that something?" Eleanor said, her tone too smooth, too measured. "Though, we can't ignore that she's been trying to manipulate him for weeks." Thomas nodded gravely. "We warned you, James. This is all part of her act." James stood, his awe twisting into suspicion. The lies Eleanor and Thomas had planted now taking root again. "What have you done to my son?" he demanded, his voice tightening. The question hit Amara harder than any insult could. She could feel Noah's grip on her hand tighten, as if he sensed the shift. "I've done nothing but care for him," Amara said, her voice steady though her chest burned. "Everything you see, every step he's taken, it's because he feels safe." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out the small, worn journal she'd been keeping since her first day. "Here. Every day we've had together is in here. What he ate, what he liked, when he smiled, when he tapped faster. You can see for yourself." James didn't take it. His gaze bounced between her and his son, as if torn between what he had just witnessed and what he'd been told. Eleanor took a step forward. "James, you can't let one moment erase weeks of concern. That boy's been through enough. She's—" "Stop!" Sophie's voice cut in from the hallway. She stepped into view, her chef's apron still dusted with flour. "James, you need to hear the truth. Eleanor and Thomas have been lying about Amara. They've tried to make her look bad from the start, because she's good at what she does, because she connects with Noah in a way they never could." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Sophie, you don't know what you're talking about. I do, Sophie shot back, her voice fierce. I've seen you accidentally spill things on her, set her up to fail, and I know about that fake recording. She turned to James. It wasn't Amara's voice. It was Eleanor's, edited to sound like her. Dr. Samuel Brooks stepped in from behind Sophie, as if the confrontation had summoned him. She's telling the truth. James, he said calmly, I've been tracking Noah's progress, and it started the day Amara arrived. He's not being manipulated. He's responding to genuine care. The room went still. James looked at Eleanor and Thomas, both of whom were suddenly very quiet. His eyes hardened. Is that true? Neither answered. Get out, James said finally, his voice low but lethal. Both of you. Now. Eleanor's face flushed with rage, Thomas's with embarrassment, but neither dared argue. They left in silence, the sound of their footsteps fading up the grand staircase. James turned back to Amara, his shoulders dropping for the first time all week. I'm sorry, he said, the words rough in his throat. I didn't see what was in front of me. Amara didn't scold him, didn't point out how close he'd come to believing the worst. She simply said, Noah needs you to see him, not just now, but every day. James nodded, his eyes glistening. He looked at his son, still holding Amara's hand, and knew that whatever came next, this was the moment that would define it, and for the first time in years. The Carter mansion didn't feel quite so silent. The day after Eleanor and Thomas were removed from the Carter mansion, the air inside felt lighter, but the real work was only beginning. James Carter sat alone in his study that morning. The journal Amara had given him open on the desk. The pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting, every date, every observation, every small victory. Tapped faster when rain started. One line read, smiled at paper airplane. Another, rested head on my shoulder for the first time. It wasn't the cold, clinical language of a medical report. It was the diary of someone who truly cared. James found himself turning the pages slowly, absorbing not just what was written, but the patience it represented. In the kitchen, Amara poured herself a cup of tea, feeling the weight of the last few weeks settle in her bones. She wasn't celebrating Eleanor and Thomas's departure. She didn't believe in winning through someone else's downfall. But she was relieved that Noah's progress wouldn't be undermined by their sabotage. Relieved that she could finally focus without the constant shadow of their disapproval. She heard footsteps and turned to see James in the doorway, the journal in his hand. I read every page, he said quietly. I can't believe I didn't see it before. Amara set down her cup. Watching him carefully, she could see something different in his posture. Not the stiff, defensive stance she'd grown used to, but something more open. You were busy protecting him the only way you knew how, she said gently. But sometimes protecting means trusting. James nodded, and for a moment he looked like a man who wasn't sure how to ask for forgiveness. I want to learn, he said. Teach me what you've been doing with him. They began that afternoon. Amara walked James through her methods, not complicated therapy techniques, just small, deliberate acts of connection. Sit with him on the floor, she instructed. Don't force him to talk. Let him show you things, even if they don't make sense to you. At first, James felt awkward, unsure how to match the rhythm of his son's quiet world. But when Noah placed a block in his hand and looked at him expectantly, James felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, an invitation into his child's space. The breakthrough came faster than either of them expected. That evening, James returned from a short phone call to find Noah in the living room, pointing toward the window where the rain had started again. Water, Noah whispered, his voice tentative but clear. James's breath caught. He knelt beside him. "Yes, water," he repeated, smiling. Noah tapped the glass and looked back at him, as if waiting for a response. James tapped it too. They stayed there like that for several minutes, the simple exchange feeling more significant than any business deal James had ever closed. In the days that followed, James made changes to his schedule. He canceled evening meetings. He turned down weekend conferences. The staff, used to his constant absence, began to notice his presence in the house, eating breakfast with Noah, helping him with simple puzzles, sitting in on the music sessions Amara led. Sophie started baking bread in smaller batches so she could bring warm slices into the living room for them to share. Dr. Brooks visited once a week, not to direct, but to observe and encourage. "He's making progress because you're both speaking his language now," the doctor told James. Noah's vocabulary grew slowly, but each new word was a milestone. "Son," he said one afternoon, pointing toward the light streaming through the balcony doors. "Book," he said another day, handing one to Amara, and then came the word that undid James completely. It was late, and James was tucking Noah into bed. He smoothed the blanket over his small frame, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Good night, son," he murmured. Noah looked at him, his eyes unblinking in the dim light. "Love you, Dad," he whispered. James had to turn away before his son could see the tears. He walked into the hallway, pressing a hand to the wall to steady himself. Years of guilt, of missed chances, of hiding from the ache of loss. All of it seemed to crash into him at once. But underneath the grief was something else. Hope. The next morning, James found Amara in the garden, trimming a row of overgrown roses. He handed her a small box, wrapped simply. "This is for you," he said. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, the kind that caught the light just so. "It's to replace the one you wear every day," he explained. "The chain's worn thin." Amara smiled, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. "Thank you," she said, though she suspected it wasn't really about the necklace. It was his way of saying what he still couldn't fully put into words, that she had given him back his son. Over the next week, the mansion felt less like a museum and more like a home. Sophie's laughter could be heard from the kitchen. Music drifted through the halls when Amara played old records for Noah. Even the security staff seemed more relaxed. For the first time in years, James wasn't walking through the house with the weight of unspoken grief pressing down on him. One evening, as the sun set over Peachtree Road, James, Amara, and Noah sat on the balcony, watching bubbles float into the warm air. Noah chased them with a delighted squeal, his small hands reaching. James turned to Amara. "Why did you take this job?" he asked. She thought for a moment before answering. "I needed a roof over my head," she said honestly. "But I stayed because Noah needed someone who wouldn't give up on him." James nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into him. He had spent years building an empire, believing that providing for his son meant protecting him from the world. But Amara had shown him that protection without presence was just another kind of absence. And now, with his son finally speaking, laughing, and reaching for more, James knew this was the real work he couldn't outsource. For the first time since Clara's death, James allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss, but by what had been found. And it all began with one word, spoken in the smallest voice, on a rainy afternoon, that broke the silence and rebuilt a family. A week after Noah first told his father, "Love you, Dad." The Carter mansion had a rhythm it hadn't known in years. Mornings began with breakfast together in the sunlit kitchen. Noah perched on the counter beside Amara as she sliced fruit. James making coffee but stopping often to join their laughter. It was an unspoken agreement now. The boy came first. but life. James knew, rarely allowed peace without testing it. That test came sooner than expected. One rainy Thursday, while James was at a meeting downtown, Amara noticed Noah unusually restless. He paced the living room, tapping faster than she'd seen in weeks, his eyes darting toward the front door. She crouched down to his level. "What is it? Sweetheart?" He didn't answer, but he tugged her hand toward the window. Outside, a familiar figure stood in the drive, Eleanor Price, holding a folder tight against her chest, her face set in that imperious look Amara knew all too well. Amara opened the door but didn't invite her in. "You shouldn't be here," she said evenly. Eleanor gave a thin smile. "I came to warn you. James may think you've won him over, but men like him, men with power, they turn. When they do, you'll be the one out on the street." Amara didn't flinch. "I'm not here for power," she replied. "I'm here for Noah." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You think that's noble? I think it's naive." She stepped closer. "People like us don't belong in houses like this. Sooner or later, they remind you of that." She shoved the folder into Amara's hands. "Just remember I tried to help." With that, she turned and walked away. Inside, Amara debated whether to open it. Curiosity won. Inside were photocopies of documents, selective pages from James's will, bank statements, and what looked like a draft employment termination letter with her name on it. It was unsigned, undated, and likely a fabrication. But she knew exactly what Eleanor wanted. Doubt. When James returned, she handed him the folder. "I think you should see this," she said. He scanned the contents, his jaw tightening, not at her, but at the clear attempt to stir trouble. "She's still trying to get to you," he said. "I'll handle it." Amara shook her head. "You don't need to handle it. Just don't let it distract you from Noah." Her refusal to be pulled into the drama struck James. He realized that in her position, most people would try to secure themselves with reassurances, maybe even ask for promises. Amara asked for nothing except his attention to his son. The next day, Dr. Samuel Brooks arrived for his weekly visit. He watched as Noah built a tower of blocks, occasionally looking to Amara for a nod of encouragement. "His progress is remarkable," Samuel told James quietly. "It's not just the words, though those are coming. It's the confidence, the eye contact. You can't fake that." James glanced toward Amara. "I know," he said. "I almost let myself believe lies about her. I won't make that mistake again." Sophie joined them later, carrying a plate of warm scones. "You know," she said, settling onto the couch, "this house used to feel like a museum. Now it feels like family." It was true. Even the security staff had noticed. There was more conversation in the hallways, more laughter in the rooms. The tension that had once seeped into every interaction was gone. And through it all, Noah blossomed. He began stringing words together. Big bubble. More juice. Bye-bye, son. Each one a victory that made James's chest tighten with gratitude. One evening, after Noah had fallen asleep, James found Amara on the balcony, leaning against the railing as the city lights shimmered below. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her. "You don't owe me," she said softly. "Noah did the work. I just made sure he had the space to try. But you stayed when it would have been easier to walk away," James insisted. "When I doubted you. When people lied about you. You stayed." She turned to face him. "Because he needed me to. And maybe you did too." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of traffic far below filling the space between them. James thought about how, just weeks ago, this house had been filled with glass walls and unspoken grief. Now, it held something else entirely. Trust. 2 days later. They were in the living room when Noah toddled over to Amara with a book in hand. "Read, please," he said. James nearly dropped his coffee. Amara smiled, taking the book and patting the couch beside her. Noah climbed up, leaning against her as she began. James sat across from them, watching the way his son's eyes followed every page, the way his small hand rested on Amara's arm. In that moment, James understood something he'd missed for years. Love wasn't in grand gestures or lavish gifts. It was in the quiet, consistent presence. It was in sitting on the floor, block in hand, matching the rhythm of a boy's taps until the taps slowed. It was in listening to the same folk song every night until it became a comfort. That night, after Amara left the room, James tucked Noah in. "Do you know how proud I am of you?" he asked. Noah nodded, a sleepy smile tugging at his lips. "Love you, Dad," he murmured before drifting off. James lingered for a moment, brushing a curl from his son's forehead. Then he stepped into the hallway, where Amara was waiting. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as staff, as part of this family." Amara hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew what that meant. Blurring lines, shifting roles, changing the shape of all their lives. "If that's what you truly want," she said finally, "then yes, I'll stay." And so, without ceremony, without contracts or conditions, they became something more than employer and employee. They became a family rebuilt not by blood alone, but by the courage to trust and the patience to love. The Carter mansion still gleamed with glass and steel, still looked like a fortress from the outside, but inside, its heart had changed, and every now and then, on quiet afternoons when the rain tapped against the windows, James would hear his son's voice, clear, confident, calling for Amara, and he'd remember the day everything began to heal. James Carter had spent years mastering the art of building towers, steel and glass skyscrapers that rose over Atlanta's skyline like monuments to his ambition. But none of those towers compared to the one that mattered now, the fragile, growing structure of trust between him and his son. Since asking Amara to stay as family, James found himself in unfamiliar territory. His calendar, once packed with back-to-back meetings, now had wide, protected spaces marked only by a single word: Noah. He still ran a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. But for the first time, he understood that some meetings couldn't be rescheduled, like building block towers at 9 in the morning or bubble-blowing contests on the balcony at sunset. Each morning began the same way now. James would make coffee while Amara sliced fruit. Noah perched on the counter between them, tapping the edge of the cutting board in his familiar rhythm. But what used to be silence was now filled with words, small, deliberate, sometimes halting, but words nonetheless. "Apple, please. More juice. Daddy's cup." Every new phrase was a victory, and James treated it that way, not with loud applause that might overwhelm him, but with a steady, proud smile and a gentle, "Good job, son." One morning, as sunlight streamed through the glass walls, Noah surprised them both. He pointed toward a framed photo of Clara, the mother he'd never known, and said, softly but clearly, "Mommy." James froze. The photo had always been there, tucked on a shelf in the corner of the living room, a quiet memory James wasn't sure how to share. He swallowed hard, walked over, and knelt beside his son. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "That's your mommy. She loved you very much." Amara watched from across the room, her eyes shining, knowing that moment was a step toward healing for both father and son. Dr. Samuel Brooks continued his weekly visits. though they felt less like formal sessions now and more like check-ins between friends. "He's not just talking," Samuel told James one afternoon. "He's connecting, the tapping, the eye contact, the gestures. They're all becoming part of a larger communication. You've created a safe space where his voice can grow." James glanced toward Amara, who was crouched beside Noah, helping him fit puzzle pieces together. "We created it," he corrected. Life in the Carter mansion shifted in subtle ways. Sophie's kitchen was no longer just a place where meals were prepared. It became a hub of warmth, with Noah sometimes sitting on the counter, legs swinging, helping stir batter. Even the security guards, once stoic and formal, now greeted him with an easy, "Hey, champ," as he toddled past. The mansion, once a glass fortress, felt lived in. It smelled of baking bread and sounded like laughter. One Saturday morning, James decided to take Noah to Piedmont Park, something he'd never attempted before. Crowds had always overwhelmed his son, but James wanted to try, carefully, with Amara at their side. They started on a quiet path, letting Noah hold his bubble wand and watch the iridescent spheres drift into the autumn air. He whispered, "Bubble," each time one floated past, his voice growing a little louder with each repetition. At one point, a golden retriever trotted over, tail wagging. Noah froze, then looked at Amara. She crouched down, her tone calm. "He's friendly," she said, holding Noah's hand as the dog sniffed gently, to James's surprise. Noah giggled, a sound so unguarded it made his chest ache with gratitude. That night, after Noah was tucked into bed, James found Amara on the balcony. The city lights shimmered, but he barely noticed. "I don't think I've said this enough," he began. "Thank you for giving me my son." Amara shook her head. "You always had him. You just needed to meet him where he was." James looked out at the skyline. "I used to think being a good father meant protecting him from the world. Now I know it means standing beside him in it." As weeks turned into months, Noah's progress continued. He began initiating conversations in his own way, pointing, naming objects, even stringing together short sentences. "Daddy, read book. Amara, sit here." Each one felt like another brick in the tower they were building together. James made a point to be present for these moments, sometimes leaving business partners baffled when he declined high-stakes meetings with nothing more than, "I have something more important." One evening, Sophie prepared a small family dinner in the dining room. Just James, Amara, Noah, Sophie, and Dr. Brooks. Noah sat between James and Amara, proudly passing roles to each person as if he were hosting, when dessert came. He looked up and said, "Thank you, Sophie." Without prompting, the room went quiet for a moment before breaking into smiles and laughter. For James, that simple courtesy carried the weight of a speech. Later that night, James stood in Noah's doorway, watching him sleep. He remembered the years when this same boy sat in silence, unreachable, locked away in a place James couldn't find. Now, he was here, still growing, still learning, but here. And the woman who had made that possible was just down the hall. He found Amara in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the dinner dishes. "I don't want this to end," he said. She glanced at him, unsure what he meant. "Not the work, not the progress, not this family we've built. It doesn't have to," she said simply. James knew then that what had started as an employment arrangement had become something far more permanent. He'd spent years building structures meant to last generations. Now, he realized the most enduring thing he'd ever build wouldn't have his name on a plaque or a skyscraper in the skyline. It would be the bond between him, his son, and the woman who refused to give up on either of them. In the quiet of that kitchen, with the city humming outside and the dishes stacked neatly in the sink, James Carter understood something he wished he'd known long ago. The greatest legacy a man could leave wasn't measured in square footage or net worth. It was measured in the love that remained when the contracts were signed, the towers built, and the deals closed. And in that moment, he knew his legacy was already taking shape. One word, one smile, one moment at a time. The first hints of spring in Atlanta brought a softness to the air, as if the city itself had decided to exhale after a long winter. In the Carter mansion, the change in season mirrored the change in its people. Gone were the days when silence pressed against the glass walls. Now, the home pulsed with life. James Carter often found himself pausing in doorways just to watch his son exist, to see Noah flipping through picture books with Amara on the balcony, or chasing bubbles across the polished walnut floors, his laughter spilling into the high-ceilinged rooms. It was in one of those pauses, on a golden Saturday evening, that James realized they had crossed an invisible line. This wasn't recovery anymore. This was living. They had spent the afternoon in the garden, a place James used to ignore, leaving its upkeep to landscapers. Now, he knelt beside Noah in the soil, helping him plant marigolds while Amara pointed out the worms and ladybugs that made the flowers grow. Noah repeated each new word Amara offered, his small voice clear and deliberate. Flower, bug, yellow. Each one felt like a gift, and James took them all. By the time the sun began to set, their hands were dirty, and their hearts were full. After dinner, James suggested they take their tea out to the Peachtree Road balcony. The city stretched before them in shades of orange and purple, the hum of traffic below mixing with the faint trill of birds settling in for the night. Noah ran ahead, clutching a bubble wand Sophie had given him earlier that day. He dipped it into the soapy mix and blew, sending shimmering spheres into the air. Amara sat on the stone ledge, watching him with that quiet attentiveness James had come to admire. For a while, they said nothing, just watched Noah chase the bubbles, giggling when they popped. Then James turned to Amara. "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked at him, curious. "Of course. Why did you really take this job?" His tone wasn't suspicious, just searching. He wanted to understand the path that had brought her into their lives. Amara thought for a long moment before answering. "When I came here, I was looking for stability. I'd been working jobs that barely paid the bills, always one step away from losing my apartment. I needed a roof over my head." She glanced at Noah, who was now leaning over the balcony rail to watch a bubble drift toward the street. "But I stayed because of him, because he needed someone who wouldn't walk away the moment it got hard." James nodded slowly. "I think maybe I needed that too." They sat in silence again. But it wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that comes when everything important has already been said. The last of the sunset faded, and Noah climbed into Amara's lap, resting his head against her shoulder. That night, after Noah was asleep, James walked through the house, noticing how different it felt. The art on the walls was the same, the furniture unchanged, but the atmosphere was lighter, warmer. It struck him that for years he had built a fortress to keep the world out. But in doing so, he had kept life out too. Amara had opened the door, not just for Noah, but for him. In the weeks that followed, the changes became visible to everyone who entered. Business associates commented on how relaxed James seemed. Sophie, now promoted to head chef, joked that she'd never heard so much laughter in the kitchen. Even Dr. Samuel Brooks admitted that he looked forward to his visits as much for the company as for the professional progress. One afternoon, James took Noah and Amara to the small park near the Carter family church. It wasn't an official event. just an ordinary outing. But to James, it felt monumental. Noah played with other children, something he'd never done before, joining a game of rolling a ball back and forth. When one of the other kids asked his name, Noah answered, without hesitation. Noah Carter. James had to turn away, blinking fast, because he didn't want Noah to see his tears. That evening, as they walked back to the car, Noah reached for both their hands, one in his father's, one in Amara's, and held on tight. It was a simple act, but to James, it was a declaration. This was his family now. The next Sunday, James invited Amara to sit with them in the family pew at church. Some in the congregation whispered, Buckhead wasn't free of its prejudices, but James ignored them. When the service ended, he introduced her to an old business acquaintance. This is Amara, he said plainly. She's family. There was no hesitation, no need to explain further. As spring deepened, so did their bond. Noah's words became sentences, his sentences became questions, and his questions, about the sky, about the flowers, about where bubbles go when they pop, filled the house with a curiosity James had thought was lost. They spent afternoons reading on the balcony, evenings baking cookies in the kitchen, and Sundays walking in the park. One night, as James tucked Noah in, the boy looked up and said, Daddy, Amara loves us. James smiled. Yes, she does, and we love her too. Later, James found Amara in the living room, straightening the pillows on the couch. He told me tonight that you love us, James said. Amara's eyes softened. I do. James stepped closer. And I want you to know, we love you too. This house, my life, wouldn't be the same without you. In that moment, with the quiet hum of the city outside and the warmth of family inside, James understood the full arc of their journey. They had gone from strangers bound by circumstance to a family bound by choice. Noah had found his voice, James had found his heart, and Amara had found a place where she was seen not as an employee, but as a cornerstone. The Carter mansion still stood tall over Peachtree Road, its glass walls catching the light. But now, inside those walls, there was something more valuable than any real estate portfolio could hold. Love freely given, trust hard-earned, and a boy's laughter breaking the silence that had once seemed unshakable. And every time Noah called out, Amara, from across the room, James would remember the first time he heard it, on a rainy afternoon when his son's voice returned not to him, but to the woman who had refused to give up. That sound had rebuilt a family, and it would echo here for the rest of their lives. Thanks for listening. If this story moved you, like and subscribe so we can share more stories that matter. See you next time.